Welcome back to the deep dive. For years now, we've been tracking the just incredible, sometimes dizzying pace of progress in artificial intelligence. We usually talk about the models, right? The software, the algorithms, all the new applications, what machines can do. But today, we're deliberately stepping back from the code. We're zooming out, way out, to look at the massive, concrete, physical foundation that actually makes all this intelligence possible. Okay, let's unpack this. Our sources today point to an infrastructure project that is, well, it's redefining big tech, honestly. We are talking about an initiative so huge, so expensive, and frankly so demanding on power grids and resources that it changes the whole game of technological competition. This is the $100 billion effort to build next-generation AI data centers right across the United States. And these places, they aren't just bigger server rooms, they are the dedicated engine rooms needed to actually reach the next stage of AI. So our mission today is to take you through just the sheer scale of the money involved, the engineering gymnastics required to pull it off, and the high-stakes global strategic picture surrounding what our sources are calling the largest private infrastructure project in U.S. history.
And framing it as infrastructure. That's absolutely key to understanding what's at stake here. This is much more than just, corporations wanting more computing power. When you really look at the investment scale, the ambition, it becomes crystal clear this is seen as a global strategic initiative. The U.S. government, well, they view this as critical to the national interest. The mission is basically to build the massive physical foundation, the power grids, the cooling systems, everything needed for what they hope will be true artificial general intelligence.
Yeah.
And the why now context, it forces a speed that it defies normal infrastructure planning cycles.
Right, and that speed is what makes this so fascinating and maybe so risky.
Precisely. Because whoever manages to build this completely unprecedented infrastructure first, they essentially achieve supremacy in AI, at least for a time. Our sources, they paint a really stark picture. They're calling this initiative potentially the new space race. But unlike the original space race, where the immediate impact was mostly geopolitical, the impacts of winning or losing this AI race, they'll be immediate, direct, disruptive. We're talking about reshaping global economies, science, even military balance faster than we've ever seen. And that is why private entities are willing to commit $100 billion.
Okay, let's start with the money. Because that number, the scale of the investment, it's the first big signal that we're dealing with something completely different here. The core figure anchoring this whole deep dive. It's a projected cost estimated at $100 billion. Yeah, and you really need to process that number. It's not just a lot of money. It's a statement about risk, about commitment, its significance. Well, it immediately makes it the largest private infrastructure investment in U.S. history, period. We are talking about capital formation usually reserved for, massive government projects. Think interstate highways, continental railroads, maybe huge utility construction. So that tells you the players involved are operating on a timeline and scale that just completely blows past traditional Silicon Valley venture capital models.
Right. When you move out of that typical VC funding world and into infrastructure financing, the whole game changes, doesn't it? The money works differently.
Oh, completely. This isn't about equity funding hoping for a quick IPO flick. No. This is long-term debt, asset-backed securities, complex financial instruments, the kind you see with major utilities projects.
So they're basically borrowing against the future value of the computing power they hope to create.
Essentially, yes. They're borrowing or raising funds against the projected future utility of computational capacity. That kind of financial structure, it requires immense confidence that AGI is actually coming and that the demand for that AGI compute will be big enough to justify this massive debt. It really blurs the line between corporate investment and, well, national utility.
Okay, so to help you, our listener, get a concrete feel for that $100 billion, because honestly, numbers that big just become abstract. The sources give some fantastic, relatable comparisons. They really bring home the scale shock.
They do. We're talking about an investment that's equivalent to building 20 entire Tesla gigafactories. 20. Now, just pause and think about what one gigafactory requires. The land, the materials, the labor, all the specialized equipment, the logistics. Multiply all of that by 20. That gives you some sense of the sheer draw this project will have on the entire supply chain. Everything from copper wire to specialized glass to concrete.
Or, get this comparison, maybe even more striking. It's like building 4-channel tunnels. 4 times the planning, the massive underground construction, the complex engineering, the political headaches, all that effort required just to connect France and England. Now, picture applying that physical magnitude to building data centers. You start to realize the scope of the concrete, the fiber, the machinery they need to source and deploy. pretty much all at once.
Exactly. It's not just the huge amount of money, it's the sheer physical volume of stuff being deployed under immense time pressure.
So what are they actually building with all this? The purpose, as we said, is dedicated to constructing these next-gen data centers across the U.S., specifically designed to push past our current computational limits. But the structure itself, how they're planning it, that seems key too. It's not one single giant site, is it?
Right. And that's a crucial strategic decision. The architecture calls for up to 8 separate locations. These will form a distributed AI network. This decentralization, it does 2 main things. First, it mitigates strategic risk, not putting all your massively sensitive eggs in one basket. And second, crucially, it allows for rapid modular expansion.
Okay, help us understand that modularity advantage. Why build 8 expandable places instead of just one monster center?
Well, it directly tackles that enormous timeline problem we mentioned. A single traditional mega center that takes easily 8 to 10 years just for planning, getting permits, and construction before it's fully up and running. In the current AI race, 8 to 10 years is basically an eternity. Modularity lets them break down that huge $100 billion investment into smaller functional chunks or nodes. They could potentially deploy the first node in, say, 18 months, maybe 2 years, start training runs almost immediately, begin generating value. And while that first one is running, the next nodes can be built in parallel. And here's the critical part. Those later nodes can incorporate newer, maybe even unreleased hardware versions. If they waited 10 years for one giant center, the tech they started with would be practically obsolete by the time it switched on. Modularity lets them keep folding to the cutting edge, accelerating the time of training run while constantly upgrading future capacity.
That speed. That's really the biggest point of tension here, isn't it? The sources say the goal is to have major parts of this network operational in just 3-4 years. That's incredibly aggressive. It means cutting the typical infrastructure timeline by more than half. They must be planning to bypass or somehow massively compress decades of standard practice in things like utility planning and construction.
Oh, absolutely. And operating under that kind of extreme pressure, it inherently ramps up the technical risk, the regulatory risk, the political risk. There's simply no time for the usual comprehensive conservative planning cycles. It's a very high-stakes, high-velocity bet on their engineering and logistical capabilities. What's fascinating here, I think, is that the physical demands are just so immense, they fundamentally change what a data center is. We're not just talking about optimizing existing tech anymore. We're talking about solving problems in power generation and thermodynamics at an industrial, almost state-like scale.
Let's focus on the size and power first, because the jump from current centers is just staggering. We're told each facility will be far larger than even the biggest existing server farms run by, say, Amazon or Google. How does that size translate into energy needs?
Well, it translates into unprecedented computational density. You have these AI chips, GPUs, specialized accelerators packed incredibly tightly together, and they're running continuously at peak performance, sometimes for months on end during training runs.
Yeah.
So the power required per facility is just enormous, somewhere between 500 and 1,000 megawatts.
Wait, did you say up to 1,000 megawatts per site? Let's put that into perspective for everyone listening.
Yeah, 1,000 megawatts, that's enough power to support somewhere between 400,000 and 800,000 homes. You are essentially dedicating the power consumption of a major medium-sized city or maybe a small metropolis entirely to training AI models.
Yeah.
And remember, that's potentially for each of the up to 8 locations they're planning.
Okay, that immediately raises a massive caution about the grid. Can existing utility infrastructure, even in places with lots of power, actually handle that kind of sudden concentrated load?
No, just no. Absolutely not. That is the core engineering problem they have to solve. Most power grids are designed for load that's distributed, spread out across residential areas or industrial parks. They simply cannot handle a single point demanding 1,000 megawatts, a point that switches on rapidly and stays on continuously for training. So this scale requires building dedicated power plants. We're talking either gas-fired plants, massive solar arrays, or maybe negotiating huge private contracts with hydro facilities, power generated specifically to feed the data center. And along with that, you need entirely new high-tension transmission lines that bypass the local distribution networks. The utility company doesn't just give you a bigger connection, you effectively have to become your own utility provider.
Wow. That sounds like a regulatory nightmare that instantly puts that 3 to 4 year timeline in jeopardy. How on earth do they plan to deal with the friction of building new power infrastructure that fast?
Well, they try to mitigate it through careful site selection, which we'll get into later, and by aggressively pushing for regulatory fast-tracking. often using the argument that this is critical for national strategy.
Yeah.
But even with fast tracking, just laying new transmission lines, securing land rights, that's normally a multi-year effort on its own. It puts extreme pressure on that construction window.
And where all that power goes, massive heat follows. Let's shift to cooling, because the heat thrown off by these next-gen AI chips, that seems like the ultimate physical limiter. You said traditional air conditioning just won't cut it?
Correct. Absolutely not. Traditional AC systems, blowing chilled air over server racks, they become incredibly ineffective and inefficient when you're dealing with the extreme thermal density of modern AI hardware. These tightly packed multi-chip modules and huge tensor core clusters, the processors just get too hot way too quickly. That leads to thermal throttling, where they slow down to avoid damage or outright system failure. So this forces them into this dilemma of needing revolutionary cooling methods. The sources seem to outline two paths, both incredibly challenging. Path 1, rely on what's called open-loop cooling. Think massive, industrial-scale evaporative cooling towers. But this leads directly to the problem you hinted at earlier. This method could potentially use as much water as a medium-sized city. And often, this isn't just occasional use. It's continuous water consumption during long training runs.
A city's worth of water, potentially in a dry region like Arizona or Nevada where power might be cheaper. That's not just a technical hurdle. That sounds like a massive political and environmental fight waiting to happen.
It is, absolutely. Securing water rights for that kind of volume, that often requires complex negotiations with multiple state and local agencies. And it almost inevitably sparks intense environmental opposition, which can slow down or even stop a project dead in its tracks. Okay, so path 2 is maybe the ideal, but it sounds highly experimental. You mentioned developing completely revolutionary closed-loop cooling.
Exactly. Things like large-scale immersion cooling, where entire servers are literally submerged in special non-conductive fluids. Now, this drastically reduces water consumption, which is great, but the engineering challenge of designing, building, and maintaining reliable industrial-scale closed-loop systems that can handle 1,000 megawatts of heat load, it's immense. It has simply never been done reliably at this scale before. They're basically pushing the known limits of physics and engineering at the same time.
Okay, so you've somehow generated the power, you've somehow managed the incredible heat, but the data still needs to move. You've got these 8 sites spread out geographically, supposed to work together like one giant brain. That brings us to the networking challenge. Yes, and the efficiency of the entire distributed system hinges on moving data between these sites seamlessly. They can't just use the regular internet. They need private fiber optic networks spanning potentially thousands of miles. And the speed requirement, it isn't just fast, it's exponential. We're talking about the capability of transferring data at exabyte scale speeds.
An exabyte, that's a billion gigabytes, right? Just to put that in perspective for you listening, the entire content of the Library of Congress is often estimated in the low petabytes. An exabyte is 1,000 petabytes. So we are talking about moving the equivalent data of thousands of libraries of Congress almost instantaneously, with minimal delay, across potentially vast distances.
Precisely. That's the level required for these distributed nodes to function as a single coherent system during massive training runs. And to achieve that, you need more than just standard commercial fiber optic cables. You need proprietary unused fiber optic strands they lease or lay themselves in dedicated trenches. Plus, you need advanced optical switching gear and specialized networking protocols designed specifically for this kind of ultra-low latency, massive bandwidth data movement between the computational nodes. This networking infrastructure cost alone, that's a major slice of that overall $100 billion budget.
So connecting this all back for you, the listener, understanding these physical requirements, the need for dedicated power plants, the city-size cooling demands, the exabyte networking, it really shows exactly why this is an infrastructure race. The amazing software breakthroughs we keep hearing about, they depend entirely on whether someone can actually physically execute these monumental engineering feats first.
Okay, so if we connect all this technical difficulty to the bigger picture, the reason for this intense pressure, this unprecedented level of private investment, it becomes instantly clear, is being driven by incredibly high-stakes global competition and, frankly, national strategic imperatives. This isn't happening in isolation, We're in a genuine global race dynamic right now. We see huge state-backed investments pouring into comparable AI infrastructure coming out of China. They are also aggressively building absolutely massive AI facilities. This race for raw computational capacity, sources suggest it's currently neck and neck, which makes the success of this big U.S. project absolutely paramount for maintaining a technological edge.
And this huge push also forces the hand of the existing U.S. tech giants, doesn't it? The sources mention Google, Microsoft, Amazon, Meta. They're all racing to keep pace with the potential scale of this new focused effort.
Exactly. They're looking over their shoulders and seeing a potential competitor or maybe partner, in some cases, building utility-scale infrastructure that could actually surpass their own internal capabilities. That forces an enormous competitive response from them too, which drives up global demand even further for all the necessary materials, the specialized talent, the
Oh.
energy resources. It creates this intense feedback loop.
And the national security angle seems impossible to ignore here.
Oh, it's central. The U.S. government views the success of this large private project as absolutely critical to staying competitive in AI overall. The argument is that leadership in AI translates directly into global economic leadership, scientific leadership, and yes, ultimately military leadership too. If you control the fastest, most powerful computational engines on the planet, you effectively control the pace of the next generation of discovery, innovation, and defense capabilities.
Let's dive a bit deeper into the financing then, because getting $100 billion together for a private infrastructure project like this, it requires some serious logistical gymnastics and pretty creative capital sources.
Indeed. And the list of potential investors isn't just your usual tech VCs. It highlights a really fascinating mix of major global players. You see sovereign wealth funds mentioned prominently, particularly Saudi Arabia. They seem to view AI compute capacity as like the oil of the 21st century. So for them, this is a long-term generational asset investment. You also see big technology investors like SoftBank involved, naturally. But crucially, you see major infrastructure financiers. These are the groups that typically back long-term, stable, almost utility-like assets, things like toll roads, pipelines, power generation facilities.
So they're essentially treating the ability to generate AGI-level compute power as a stable utility, like electricity or water, something with predictable long-term demand.
That seems to be the bet they're making, yes. And this diverse pool of funding, especially the infrastructure money, it puts very specific demands on where these facilities can actually be built.
Okay. So the money dictates the location strategy.
Absolutely, because the entire economic feasibility of this $100 billion project hinges on getting cheap, reliable power. Site selection becomes almost purely a game of logistics. It overrides traditional factors like being close to existing coastal tech hubs. The criteria are apparently hyper-specific. Number one, access to cheap and abundant energy. That is paramount. So they're scouting sites near major renewable sources, big hydro dams, large solar farms, or areas with access to cheap natural gas anywhere they can lock in low, predictable long-term power costs. Number two, sufficient water for those massive cooling systems we discussed. That's a non-negotiable, which again leads to those tricky negotiations with local water authorities.
And the existing physical infrastructure in the area has to be pretty robust already, I assume.
Exactly. They need strong, established fiber optic connections nearby, or at least easy access to corridors where they can lay their own proprietary dark fiber for that essential exabyte-scale networking between the sites. And finally, maybe the trickiest one, favorable, fast-moving regulations. They need local and state governments that will allow the aggressive 3-4-year construction timeline. If a potential site requires, say, an 8-year environmental review process, it's immediately off the list, no matter how cheap the power is.
Okay, so based on that combination, cheap power, water access, fiber, and fast approvals, where are the sources suggesting these 8 hubs might actually end up being built?
Well, the potential sites seem concentrated in areas that best meet those specific energy and space demands. Texas comes up frequently. It has a relatively decentralized power grid, lots of energy resources, and generally a pretty favorable regulatory environment for large projects. Nevada and Arizona are also strong contenders. They offer vast amounts of space, existing infrastructure corridors from other industries, and significant access to large-scale renewable solar projects. And the Pacific Northwest is mentioned as highly attractive, primarily because of its huge potential for hydroelectric power. Hydro offers clean, consistent baseload energy, which is critical for running these machines continuously for months during training. The choices really underscore how things like the environment, the climate, the state of the local grid itself, they become absolutely integral, non-negotiable parts of the final AI solution. It's not just about the chips anymore.
Right. So we've established the absolutely monumental hardware foundation they're trying to build, the dedicated power plants, the revolutionary cooling, the billions tied up in infrastructure debt. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, right? What is the ultimate prize? What are they actually chasing at the end of this incredibly expensive, incredibly difficult construction sprint?
The core ambition, the thing that supposedly justifies this entire $100 billion outlay. It's achieving artificial general intelligence, AGI. This sheer scale of computational power provided by this immense distributed network. It's believed by the project's backers to be the necessary physical condition to finally unlock AGI. That means an AI that's on par with or potentially surpasses human cognitive capabilities across a vast range of tasks, not just narrow ones. They believe this is the computational brute force needed to push past the current limitations of specialized AI.
And if they do succeed, if they build this thing and actually unlock true AGI capability, the sources talk about utterly revolutionary applications. This is where you get those aha moments that could transform science, medicine, commerce, everything.
Absolutely. Take drug discovery as a prime example. Right now, the big bottleneck is the incredibly slow, iterative process of simulating molecules, testing them in wet labs, running clinical trials. It can take decades and billions of dollars to bring one drug to market. The kind of computational power this network aims to provide could allow for the simultaneous simulation and testing of literally billions of chemical compounds and their interactions, almost instantly.
So instead of a 10-year process to find promising drug candidates, you could potentially shrink that down to months, maybe even weeks. That would fundamentally rewrite biotech.
Exactly. It's that kind of timeline compression that changes how science itself is done. Or think about climate modeling. The ability to run incredibly high-resolution climate simulations, incorporating vastly more variables with unprecedented accuracy. It could allow for much better long-term forecasting and much better analysis of which mitigation strategies might actually work. Current climate models are always limited by the available computing resources. This new infrastructure aims to effectively remove that constraint, leading to potentially actionable, highly complex, predictive analysis of our environment.
And the potential impact on global finance and industry sounds enormous too. Imagine an AI that could provide real-time economic and market analysis on a scale that's just impossible for human teams today, processing every single trade, every global news feed, every supply chain data point, all simultaneously.
Yeah, this moves beyond just building slightly better predictive models based on historical data. This kind of infrastructure could allow for instantaneous real-time understanding of incredibly complex interlocking global systems. It offers a level of market awareness or maybe even system awareness that could potentially destabilize traditional economic cycles. If you can understand the system almost perfectly in real time, you might be able to control it, or at least react to it, with near-perfect efficiency.
And finally, the sources mention the potential for AI-driven independent scientific research.
Yes, this is maybe the most profound implication. The sheer computational scale means these systems might not just follow human prompts or run simulations we design. They could potentially become capable of forming their own novel hypotheses, designing complex virtual experiments to test them, running those simulations within their own synthetic environments, and generating entirely new scientific knowledge with relatively minimal human oversight. That kind of self-directed discovery capability, that's pretty close to an operational definition of AGI being applied directly to scientific advancement itself.
But how does the specific architecture, this 8-site distributed network, how does that actually enable this massive parallel computing capability? Why is spreading it out necessary for AGI rather than one giant machine?
It's necessary because the kind of problems AGI needs to solve aren't linear. They are inherently massive and require parallel processing on an unbelievable scale. So the system is designed to function by breaking down a single enormous problem, like training a foundational model, or running a global simulation into thousands, maybe millions, of smaller components that can be processed simultaneously across all 8 nodes. This requires holding immense amounts of data in active memory, the ability for all nodes to instantly access, recall, and cross-reference petabytes, maybe exabytes, of training data. And that's where the ultra-low latency exabyte-at-scale networking we talked about becomes absolutely critical. It has to make those 8 physically separate centers appear, computationally, as one single giant seamless brain. It needs to be capable of running these continuous real-time simulations across colossal data sets without any communication bottlenecks or delays. Without that flawless physical connection knitting them together, the software potential just breaks down. You just have 8 isolated, much less powerful systems.
Which re-emphasizes that core point again, doesn't it? These revolutionary applications, AGI, super-fast drug discovery, breakthroughs in climate science, they are entirely dependent on the successful and rapid execution of the physical stuff. Securing the land, building the power plants, solving that intractable cooling dilemma we laid out earlier, the ultimate ambition is software, but the immediate ceiling is pure hardware and infrastructure.
But, as compelling as that vision of AGI is, the sheer scale and, importantly, the velocity of this whole undertaking, it introduces equally massive, maybe even existential risks, both technical and societal, which I think raises an important question we need to address. When you decide to build the largest private infrastructure project in history, and you decide to do it at breakneck speed, what fundamental safety and structural trade-offs are you inevitably making along the way?
Let's start with the technical risks, particularly related to the grid, which we touched on earlier. The sources definitely raise concerns that the sheer power demands needing up to 1,000 megawatts per site might actually destabilize existing power grids in the regions where these centers land.
Right, and that risk is really amplified by the speed they're aiming for. Utility companies normally need years, sometimes decades, to properly plan grid upgrades and reinforce transmission lines for major new loads. A sudden, massive, concentrated load like this, it can potentially lead to frequency fluctuations, brownouts affecting surrounding homes and businesses, or even, in worst-case scenarios, cascade failures across a whole regional grid, especially if it comes online during periods of peak residential demand, like a heat wave. The company building this essentially becomes a critical but potentially volatile major customer that the grid has to serve, possibly at the expense of stability for everyone else. Then there's the hardware failure risk at scale. Since the cooling systems absolutely must be revolutionary, either using those unprecedented amounts of water or relying on complex, largely unproven closed-loop technologies like immersion cooling, the chance of a systemic failure has to be considered high. If a critical pump fails or a heat exchanger in a massive immersion system gets clogged, the processors generate heat so incredibly rapidly that a major computational node could be knocked offline almost instantly. That means losing potentially vast resources and having billions of dollars in sunk costs just sitting idle.
And on the connectivity side, too, we're pushing the absolute limits of data transfer. Is there a risk that the networking infrastructure, even if built, just won't perform as needed?
Absolutely. That networking infrastructure, designed to operate at exabyte scale speeds across 8 potentially distant sites, it might hit unforeseen technical bottlenecks or latency issues once it's actually deployed and handling real-world AGI training loads. If the individual nodes can't communicate fast enough, fluidly enough, they simply can't function as that single unified AGI engine they're designed to be. The whole distributed concept relies on that network performing flawlessly. And beyond the purely engineering hurdles, that aggressive 3-4 year timeline creates immense regulatory and community risks. Because the deployment goal is so rapid, it inherently means that the time usually dedicated to things like comprehensive environmental impact statements, EIS, public consultations, securing complex permits, all that has to be compressed, maybe even shortcuts taken. This makes the entire project highly vulnerable to legal challenges from environmental groups or other stakeholders, which could cause significant delays.
And the inevitable community opposition, the not in my backyard or NIMBYism factor. That sounds like a huge threat to the timeline, too. When a single facility needs the water supply of a small city or requires a dedicated power plant built nearby, you can guarantee that local residents, environmental groups, maybe farmers worried about water rights, they will organize.
Exactly. And that kind of determined community pushback can seriously disrupt construction schedules or potentially halt parts of the project entirely. Gaining and maintaining the social license to operate becomes just as critical and maybe just as difficult as solving the technical hardware challenges. But perhaps the most profound risks, the ones that keep safety researchers up at night, are strategic and, well, existential. They center around this immense centralization of power.
That seems to be the core conflict the sources keep highlighting, right? Concentrating this unprecedented level of computational power, potentially the key to AGI, into the hands of essentially one company or consortium.
Absolutely. The central critique is that funneling the computational capacity deemed necessary for AGI into, say, 8 tightly controlled nodes, all owned and operated by a single entity. That could fundamentally reduce safety and dramatically increase the risks of developing an uncontrollable AI. How so? Well, safety researchers point to several potential dangers with this centralized approach. First, it creates a single point of catastrophic failure. If a sophisticated bad actor compromises the network, or if there's a critical, unforeseen technical flaw, it could affect the entire path to AGI. Second, it inherently limits the diversity of safety approaches being tried. If the entire frontier effort runs on one homogeneous infrastructure, using maybe similar safety protocols across all nodes, then any shared, unaddressed flaw in that approach becomes universal and much harder to catch. And third, critics argue it significantly reduces transparency and external oversight. If the most powerful models are being trained exclusively on this private closed infrastructure, how can independent researchers verify the safety claims or test the models thoroughly before deployment?
So, the very centralization and speed that seem necessary to win the race to get this infrastructure built in that 3-4 year window are simultaneously the factors that critics argue make the resulting AGI potentially much more dangerous.
That's the inherent tension, yes.
Yeah.
It creates this really dramatic contrast, especially when you consider the origins of, say, OpenAI, an organization that started with a nonprofit mission, emphasizing safety and open research above all else, now finds itself potentially constructing infrastructure rivaling the scale and cost of government megaprojects,
Yeah.
effectively potentially controlling the primary physical pathway to what might be the most powerful technology ever created. So the fundamental question that emerges is, are the urgent needs of speed and scale in this global race now being prioritized over those initial, perhaps more cautious commitments to distributed development, external verification, and provable safety? The infrastructure itself, how it's built, who controls it, how open it is becomes a central flashpoint for the entire AI safety debate.
So, we have completed our deep dive today into this truly mind boggling $100 billion AI infrastructure race. It's really been a journey, hasn't it? Taking us from these raw investment figures, the largest private capital project in U.S. history, backed by sovereign wealth funds and infrastructure giants, all the way to the scientific promise, or maybe peril, of achieving artificial general intelligence. We've tried to give you a sense of the sheer physical scale involved, the need for dedicated power plants that could strain existing grids, the demand for city-sized volumes of water just for cooling, the incredible engineering challenge of moving data at exabit speeds across thousands of miles of custom fiber. And remembering that all of this is being driven by this intense, high-stakes geopolitical competition, particularly against global rivals like China, with success or failure potentially being measured in just the next 3 to 4 years of frantic construction.
The tension is just undeniable, isn't it? On one hand, this infrastructure seems like the only conceivable path right now to unlocking those truly revolutionary applications we talked about, transforming drug discovery, getting a real handle on climate modeling, maybe fundamentally changing science itself, potentially providing exponential breakthroughs for humanity. Yet on the other hand, the breakneck pace required and the monumental centralization of computational power that results, they introduce these profound, maybe even existential risks. We face potential grid instability, massive regulatory and environmental hurdles, and these deeply critical ethical debates over who should control what could become the most powerful technology ever conceived by humans. Our sources really leave us, and hopefully leave you, with a profound strategic question to keep wrestling with. The central tension remains this. Will this massive, centralized concentration of power and infrastructure ultimately make AI safer, perhaps by accelerating the path to a controllable AGI under potentially more unified technical oversight? Or will it actually accelerate systemic risks beyond human comprehension and control, precisely because the overwhelming need for speed inevitably outweighed the need for caution and broader participation? That feels like the ultimate tension riding on the success or failure of the next 3 to 4 years of digging, wiring, and building.